Welcome to Siliconsciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important. Hello and welcome to Siliconsciousness. I'm your host, David Rothkopf, and we are joined this week by a guest who is uniquely capable to address some of the subjects I know that are of greatest interest to you. His name is David Danks. He is a professor of data science, philosophy, and policy at the University of California, San Diego. David also served until recently on the National AI Advisory Committee. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Sometimes I start trying to link what we're going to talk about to the news. And obviously, there's a lot of news on these fronts. These past couple of weeks, we have a new administration, a new team of people associated with AI, a new kind of emergent philosophy towards AI, or perhaps some new fault lines in the debate over that philosophy. But I'm going to pick a story that might seem out of left field and see if you can offer some light to why it's not from left field. Because today the NASDAQ and other stock markets were a brutal day for tech stocks, particularly AI stocks. And one of the reasons for this is that there was kind of a growing awareness of a Chinese AI product called DeepSeek, which was developed for much less money than a lot of the products in the US, which works much more quickly, was trained much more easily, and has given pause to a lot of investors. You know, does the US maintain the edge? But of course, it raises a whole host of other questions. For example, questions associated with AI and security. I know a subject you've written about. Because DeepSeek, in a matter of no time at all, became the number one app on the Apple App Store. And it's because it's free, because it's open source, maybe even because it's a good app. And I was just wondering what your reaction was to this development and where you see it might have repercussions.
Yeah, I think the emergence of DeepSeek has absolutely thrown everybody into a bit of a state of turmoil because it seems to have capabilities that are close to maybe one generation ago of the models that were coming from OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and the like. So it's close to the frontier, but as you said, the reports are that it was trained on many fewer GPUs, the really high performance chips that are typically used, and for a lot less money and power. And I think one of the things that a lot of us are really wrestling with right now is actually just trying to understand exactly what it is that happened with DeepSeek. How did they train the model? How much of it is that they were able to leverage ideas that we never would have had if not for some of the giant models that have been built? It's unclear whether this is sort of a one-shot. They were able to do things that more efficiently than OpenAI, but they're not going to be able to get out to the frontier, right? So one question is DeepSeek just going to lag behind wherever the latest generation is? that seems possible given some of the reports that have come out about exactly what they did. But of course, we're all still trying to figure out exactly what happened. But I do think that, as you said, there is a bigger moral here, which is if it hadn't been DeepSeek, it would have been somebody else, because we're constantly figuring out how to do things more efficiently with less compute, less power, less data. And in that sense, many of the restrictions that people have tried to put on AI systems, export control on chips or export control on algorithms or ideas, were, I think, largely doomed to, I don't want to say failure, but they were unlikely to have the kind of strong impact that people hoped. Rather, these ideas are going to get out there, or people will be inventive and find new ways to build these models on CPUs instead of GPUs. So in that sense, I think the security implications were expected for a while now, and it just was a question of when it was going to happen. And now I think we're wrestling with, were these companies overvalued? What is it that is that additional 0.5 percentage point of performance that you get out of OpenAI's O4 versus the DeepSeek R1? And these kinds of questions that are always a challenge when you're out at the very cutting edge of the technologies.
Yeah, well, I'm a foreign policy guy and a national security guy. And so, I had a lot of conversations with people about small yard, high fence, and we're going to keep the Chinese from getting this stuff. And I whenever anybody would ask me, including some fairly senior people, I would say this isn't going to work, because A, we can't keep it from them. B, what we can keep from them, we can't keep from them for long. C, they're going to do some innovation, and that's going to have a bigger effect. But there's another element to this. And I think it's a fairly profound element in terms of the evolution of AI, whether DeepSeek is exactly what we say it is, or whether it's DeepSeek 2.0, the next thing that is this. And that is that the U.S. has kind of looked at this from the point of view, this is the new thing, and everybody's going to want the cutting edge, and everybody's going to want the most powerful tool. And we're going to be able to dictate terms to the world. You want our NVIDIA chips, you got to do this. You can't talk to the Chinese, etc. Well, as it turns out, and I spend a lot of time talking to people in emerging markets, most of those people are perfectly happy with just good enough AI, right? They're perfectly happy with 80% solutions, especially if they cost a lot less and they come with a lot fewer strings. Now, on the one hand, not so great for the U.S. trying to dictate terms to the world. On the other hand, if the AI revolution is the Industrial Revolution 2.0, it's going to change everything. There is a kind of moral benefit, I guess, that comes with it, which is, it should be available to everybody. And if it's super expensive and super exclusive, that's going to give an edge to the people with the most money. And this could be an inequality driver. And this is definitely a field where, I and other people sort of hope that there are going to be some levelers as well. What's your thought?
So I certainly agree that AI has the potential to be a leveler. I think one of the big questions is who is driving the leveling? And I think one of the challenges that exists right now, and this is something that some of us at UC San Diego are trying to work on, is how do we think about the capability and capacity building in developing markets so that they can have an AI ecosystem that supports the needs of those developing markets, as opposed to having the choice right now of, well, you can get your US AI, your EU AI, or your China AI. How do we have, to pick another country that's been in the news today, Colombia. How do they have a Colombian AI that really is focused on the needs of people in those countries and in those markets? So I think that one of the challenges is really realizing the possibilities that you're raising in terms of leveling. I also think that you hit on a good point when you say most people care about getting it to be good enough, and in particular, good enough for a particular purpose. I think we've been in the US for the last couple of years so focused on building systems that are as general purpose as possible that we've occasionally lost the thread of people want AI in order to do things in their lives or in their companies or in their governments. They don't just want a general purpose computer. And so I think that this sort of has jolted at least some people back into recognizing the importance of really thinking about how do we have AI systems that actually benefit people, which means you have to talk to people. You have to figure out what they need. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for American innovation and leadership, including in engagement with developing markets, but only if we have a certain kind of humility. If we're willing to say, we don't know what everyone else needs, let's go find out and then build the best AI systems for their needs. I think there's a real opportunity here.
Yeah, no, there's no question about that. And of course, these kind of breakthroughs certainly come in the areas of technology pretty regularly. This one seems to have come pretty quickly, but I think that's a characteristic of this particular revolution. I'm going to switch the focus a little bit because I was particularly interested in talking to you because I'm very interested in the philosophical debates that ought to be taking place around AI that really aren't taking place as much as they need to be. There have been some debates about, existential issues and so forth, but not the sort of quotidian philosophical issues that are likely to be involved in something that affects many, many, many different facets of life. But let me make the transition to that by once again going back to the news, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper. It was inevitable, regardless of who won the election, that this administration, whichever served from 2025 through the next 4 years, would spend more time thinking about AI and its implications than the last one did, because technology has grown. But something else obviously has happened with this administration. It is perceived to be, for the moment, extremely close to a lot of leaders in Silicon Valley. And there are some assumptions that people have made. Well, these guys, they're going to get rid of regulations, and then they're going to, make more money and more profits for themselves, and they'll screw the consumer and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, at least, that's the narrative from one side in the political debate. But when you say these guys, it is mostly guys, but when you say these guys, Elon Musk's views towards AI are not the same as the views of the people who are running OpenAI. In fact, there's a rift. David Sacks's views or Mark Andreessen's views do not necessarily dovetail with Jeff Bezos's views or Mark Zuckerberg's views. There's no monolith here, partially because each one of these companies has a set of vested interests, partially because these people actually do run a range of philosophical points of view. And so, I think the last administration spent a lot of time sort of looking at the sort of a starter set for AI. Let's do an EO that says to everybody, study AI because we need to have, plans. It didn't go much beyond that because we weren't there yet. What's your expectation from this amalgam of AI invested people way up at the top of the food chain in this administration?
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right that it's sometimes the public rhetoric seems to suggest that there's the monolith of the tech bros. And there's a lot more diversity than people realize. But I do think that we're seeing a very significant shift, which is in the previous administration, many of the people involved in AI policy, most notably in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, came from civil society and academia. They were coming from nonprofits. They were coming from a point of worrying about how can government shape AI so that it brings benefit to all, or at least reduces the harms to those who are not necessarily having a seat at the table. I think the signals that we're seeing so far from the new administration is very much focused on people with a background in venture capital and in tech development, and the idea that there are market forces and market ways to shape technology through competition that will ultimately address many of these issues. So I do think I'm trying hard not to use the term libertarian, because I don't know that it's a strictly speaking I'm not sure that that's really the right word to use in many of these cases for many of these individuals. But I do think that there's a greater faith that markets will be able to address biases, harms that disproportionately affect certain groups, and these sorts of things, rather than having to look to regulation and practice and policy. So in that sense, I do think that the dominant narrative is right, that we're going to see a pullback in terms of regulation. Many of the moves that were in the big omnibus executive order under former President Biden, that executive order was a day one rescission, and there is not yet a new policy in place. There's an executive order directing folks to come up with the policy in the next 180 days, but I expect that it probably will not have the same kind of focus on audit, evaluation, and other kinds of governance mechanisms. That's not to say that it's going to be worse. It's to say that I think there's a different set of tools that people are going to be looking to in this current administration. The big challenge here is, I think, going to be, in many cases, if we want to allow the market to do the work, then we need to make sure that there's enough variation within the market. There need to be competition. There needs to be alternative ways of approaching many of these kinds of problems. And I think this is one where many people are concerned about the fact that there is a kind of consolidation in just a few companies. And so one of the things that I certainly will be watching for is, are there efforts to ensure that there's enough diversity and competition in the market so that things like, who has the least biased algorithm, and I don't mean that in the DEI sense, I mean that in a fairly technical sense, that's something that the market can actually help to shape. Whereas if it's just one or two companies that are dominating everything, then we're not going to see that. So I think it'll be interesting to watch and see whether the market conditions match the things that people want to hand over to the market.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I think the DeepSeek discussion is so interesting, because
Exactly.
essentially there are a bunch of people who thought, well, the technology for producing these super powerful chips has such a high sort of cost of entry that it would be a barrier to entry for a lot of other people to enter into it. But of course, what happened is, at least theoretically, and I suspect we're going to have some debate about what the actual capabilities of this particular technology are, that what happened was people said, well, okay, well, I can't solve that problem, so maybe I can solve a different problem. Maybe I can solve the problem through my algorithm, through the coding, through the speed of training, through other kinds of things. Now, if somehow DeepSeek or something like it all of a sudden says, well, for $30 million, I can get you into this game, or for $100 million, I can get you into this game, not the 500 billion or whatever, President Trump was talking about last week. It's going to be a big game changer, because people are going to start saying, well, I'm going to develop my own, and I'll undercut the price, or it'll be proprietary in my space, or whatever. And that's I think quite, an interesting development. But just go on.
Well, I was just going to say, and I think I do think something that's important to say that some of the listeners might not be aware of is that this has come, the DeepSeek sort of innovation comes at a really ideal time, because there is, and already was, a rapidly growing sort of ecosystem of startups whose whole focus was, how do we take these general purpose models and specialize them for particular companies, particular sectors, particular uses. So there are a number of companies out there that exactly are trying to make sure that there's competition at the consumer facing or even the B2B facing sort of level. And then they kind of black box. Do we use OpenAI? Do we use Anthropic? Do we use Google? We as a startup don't care. We'll just plug in whoever's cheapest. So I think we were already seeing the emergence of a market that could really, where we could actually have people be able to vote with their wallets in an important way. And so I think the DeepSeek innovation is only going to accelerate that.
Yeah, I think that's true. But there are other issues associated with philosophical issues. You mentioned, there's I don't want to misquote you, but he sort of talks European AI, American AI, Chinese AI. Each one of those things comes with a different philosophical set. European set is let's protect the consumer. American set is, to oversimplify, let's protect the company. Chinese set is let's protect the state. And a lot of things flow out of that. But from the point of view of competitiveness, we had on the last week's episode, we had Vivek Wadhwa, and he was talking about a biotech company that he's got, and he's saying, well, we're gonna test this out in India because their views of data privacy are such that we can get hundreds of thousands of data points for diagnostics, whereas the US views are more protective, and we'd only be able to get scores of them, harder still in Europe. And so part of our philosophical debate ends up, as we saw in DeepSeek, but as I'm also illustrating in this particular case, driving the competitiveness debate. As people start saying, well, I need more of this. I mean, the Chinese, who don't want an open model that presents political ideas that are offensive to them, have a big advantage when it comes to building giant models that use lots of data that Americans would consider private, where they can say, no, the Beijing Genome Institute, we need 100 million DNA, models, 100 million records of private DNA, so we can use that to go and develop, find correlations that may be relevant, for example, to orphan diseases, right? So, I'm just interested in your view on that tension.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are this is a very old set of pros and cons for the different kinds of approaches. So as you said, a Chinese approach, they're able to access enormous amounts of data very quickly, but it tends to be done in the service of centrally directed goals, and so you don't get the creativity and flourishing that can occur when you have people able to really pursue new ideas that might fall outside of the norm or would not be necessarily coming from a large group decision making. On the EU side, for example, it's much slower there and it's much harder to develop systems, in part because with the EU AI Act, you now have a whole lot of requirements about testing your models. On the other hand, you don't have to go back and fix things later. There's a standard sort of estimate in software engineering that to fix a problem that you discover in the design phase is 1/30th of the cost of fixing it once you've deployed the system, right? So there's this enormous benefit to figuring out ahead of time where the risks are and mitigating the risks. So while the European approach might look slower in the short run, it's often more effective in the long run because they can identify the issues before they deploy the system. They don't have to go back and fix things. And so I think that there's one of the real challenges is that at any moment in time, what's needed is flexibility. What's needed is to be able to say, here's the challenge that we face in this moment. Let's adjust the ways that we're developing our AI systems in response to that. I'm a biased observer here, but I tend to think that that's the benefit of the American approach, is that we do tend to allow for more flexibility. It's that you can pursue new ideas without having to get top-down approval, but we do it in ways that enable feedback loops from consumers, from civil society, from advocacy organizations to provide a bit of a check on what we're building. Does it mean we're going to be a little slower in some cases? Does it mean that the models will be a little smaller? Maybe, but innovation thrives under constraints. DeepSeek is an ideal example of this, right? They have a whole lot of architectural innovations in their network model precisely because they couldn't get access to 16,000 GPUs like Meta uses. So I tend to think that there's real opportunity here, that we have other kinds of innovation that could result from the constraints we happen to face here in the U.S.
Just as an aside, I think it will favor some people for some things and other people for other things because different systems, work that way. I will also add as an aside before I get on to the next question. I think we have a tendency in the United States to fetishize ourselves and say, well, we're that much more creative and that much more innovative. And there's a lot of creativity and innovation elsewhere, including in China. And, if you go to China and you spend time in China, you will see a society that to a degree, which is hard for Americans to comprehend, is much more app and technology driven than we are even.
Yeah.
And, for those of you who went from TikTok to Red Note a couple of weeks ago, you may know this. But let's go back, and I lament our lack of time, but let's go back to the philosophy of this administration and how that translates into implementation. You talked about a libertarian philosophy, and I think that's the view of a lot of people. Although, sometimes, the word
Right.
libertarian cloaks a, lower regulation, more profit for me at the bottom line viewpoint, right? But one of the issues is accountability, responsibility. Now, you've written about that in a variety of ways. I particularly liked this piece that you wrote. I'm just pulling it up here, called "Medieval Theology as an Old Take on a New Problem: AI Responsibility." I have a soft spot for anything that goes way back in history to find a root. But I could just imagine that as we're debating who's accountable for what, and who gets the upside, who gets the downside, who gets the credit, who gets the blame, which your article talks about, the impulse of a lot of people in this administration will be to say, let's not worry about it. Let's not have accountability. Let's try to reduce all of that to the minimums for now. Do you share the view that that's a likely impulse of some in this administration?
Yes, yeah, I do think that there is, and I think that it's a natural impulse because, in part, many of the people involved in this will have either an emotional or financial or both stake in what happens with AI systems, given where they're coming from. I think that it's absolutely crucial, though, that we think carefully about, and this is what my collaborator, Mike Kirby at the University of Utah, and I are trying to do in the piece you mentioned and some subsequent work we're doing. It's really crucial that we think about how to distinguish between responsibility for, in some sense, the kind of inevitable mistakes that are going to happen. Errors happen, mistakes happen, accidents happen. And we want to we need to be able to distinguish between that and when the AI, in some sense, should have done better. And I think that that's only going to become more important and more pressing as we have things like increasing self-driving capabilities in vehicles. Increasingly, we're going to see people who are involved in accidents involving the car doing the driving, and there will be a temptation to say, well, the person knew what they were doing when they put it into full self-driving mode, for example. But, I think the psychological and sociological evidence is quite clear. People do not know what they're doing. They don't know how to make those decisions because they don't have the right kinds of information or background experiences. So one of the big challenges is, I think, how do we empower people either to make appropriate decisions or empower them to push back and gain recourse when things go wrong, when they didn't have the opportunity to make the right kind of decision or they didn't have the information to. How do they hold people accountable when that happens? I think that there are real concerns about whether the current administration is going to have the kind of role for government that I think is important for those kinds of things. Empowering people against large companies is one of the things government actually can do a pretty good job of. And I think what we're seeing so far are signals that it's going to be a very hands-off administration in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, one reason I'm particularly interested in the philosophical debate is that, the last time the world went through a revolution like this, which I would argue is the Industrial Revolution is a good analogy. We had sort of 250 years to evolve our philosophical thinking. You know, in the first year of the Industrial Revolution, or sort of roughly at the beginning, it was 1776. Let's pick a year. Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations. You know, it was 60, 70 years later that Karl Marx said, no, I have a different idea about the economics of this and what it means for somebody to control the means of production and so on and so forth. It was another 100 years before European socialism emerged as a model, and another 50 years before, a Chinese version of this emerged as a model. So we've been having this debate for a long period of time, but things move kind of slowly. It took us a couple hundred years to get from the first industrialized countries to having China be fully industrialized, right? This is moving much faster, and the consequences could be much more rapid. Do you think, and the people, if people know AI, you'll forgive me for saying this, their first impulse is, I'm going to go work for OpenAI and make $800,000 a year as a first-year coder. Then I want to go to a university and study philosophy. But we kind of need that, as all of this evolves. And the question is, what are the costs of the failure to have these philosophical discussions? And by the way, when I say philosophical discussions, not to make the answer more complicated, you have economic philosophical discussions, equity, inequity, and so on. The means of production question comes back up. You have social ones. You have moral responsibility questions that are associated, ethical questions that are associated, legal structure questions that are associated. Should, if a sentient machine commits a crime, is it responsible? That kind of thing. So, I'm just, I guess I'm asking you to frame the stakes here. And, it's one thing if in 1806, I'm just making that up, a steam engine blows up and 13 people are killed, and people say, oh, we need a regulation about steam engines. And it's another thing if 100 billion people all of a sudden discover that something that they didn't know that they had rights to, like their data or their privacy, goes off and is used in another direction.
Right. Yeah, I think I would echo you and say the stakes couldn't be higher. I think the speed at which everything is changing, as you said, is absolutely a hallmark of what we're living through over the last 5 to 10 years. And for those who might say, well, how big of a deal is it, that things are moving rapidly? My response would be to say, imagine, as with the Industrial Revolution, but let's just say some economic sector lost 500,000 jobs over the course of 20 years. That would be tragic. A lot of people would be displaced. We'd have to do a lot. But the reality is we can absorb that as a society. We can absorb that as an economy. If 500,000 people lose their job in 20 days or 20 hours, we don't know how to absorb that. We've built structures for a world that moves more slowly than where we are now. And so I think it's absolutely critical that, as you're saying, we have these discussions and debates and try to figure out what kind of a world do we want to create? And I really do mean we create. There is often this rhetoric around AI as though it's some tsunami that's just bearing down on us, and all we can do is sort of hunker down, close, board up the windows and hope that we're still standing once AI sweeps through. But of course, AI is built by us. We are the ones making decisions about what kinds of AI to build. We are the ones making decisions about what kinds of AIs to purchase or use, or where we're going to allow it to be used. And it often to me feels as though we're just sort of stumbling forward, assuming that the structures that we've put in place, economic structures, social structures, legal structures, are all just going to work. But as you said, AI is moving so quickly and changing things so fast. And unlike a car, once I figure out something with AI, I can use it everywhere instantly. If I figure out a new idea for a car, it's going to take 10 years to build all the cars with this, new idea and to get the turnover in vehicles. So I think we just are fundamentally unprepared for how fast things are and will continue to change. And we have to figure out, what do we really care about? And then maybe we can start to use existing structures to bring that about. But without, as you said, the philosophical discussions about what kind of a world we even want, I fear that we're just going to stick with the status quo, and we know the status quo is not going to work very well.
I agree. And that's why I think the work you're doing is so important. And that is why I warn you, we'll come back to you, not only for more podcasts, but we're doing all sorts of scenario exercises, live events that are looking at where we could go from here. And I want to make sure we've got philosophers at the table. And then someday I'm going to call you up and say, I'd like to see a symposium in Washington. And by the way, I mean like Plato's symposium, not like we have it now, where we get some of the people who are lawmakers together so that they can start thinking about these things philosophically, as opposed to in the sort of quasi-commercial terms of our current legislators who are saying, who's going to donate the most to my campaign? So, what you're doing is great, and I hope you won't turn us away when we come asking for more.
Well, this has been a really fun conversation, David. I really enjoyed it, and you know how to reach me, and I would love to continue moving the conversation forward in partnership with you all.
Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate it. Folks, follow what David is writing, and follow us each week here at Silicon Consciousness and our other events and podcasts that have to do with AI at the DSR network. Until then, thanks, David. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.